If you were trying to show someone how to run the football, Corey Dillon highlights should be one of the first things you pull up. He had the size and the physicality to play a bruising style of football, and he definitely didn't shy away from the contact. But he also had an uncharacteristic elusiveness for someone his size, and possessed some of the greatest field vision of any running back. He had a cloud over his head throughout his career due to his off-the-field reputation. But on the field, what Corey Dillon was able to do on some terrible teams only makes you wonder just how good he could have been in a better situation. He was one of the only bright spots during a very dark period of Cincinnati Bengals football, never experiencing the playoffs or even a winning season in his 7 years there, yet consistently being at the top of the league's rushing leaderboards. Then as soon as he got to a winning situation, he turned around the Pats' rushing offense, en route to a Super Bowl ring. He would remain a valuable veteran runner for the Pats until his retirement after 10 seasons. But from start to finish, Corey Dillon did all you could ask for and then some at the running back position. Let's jog your memory. A Seattle native, Dillon developed his aggressive running style through what he described as rough football, growing up playing tackle football on cement. He attended Franklin High School, where he was a standout for the Quakers on the football field, eventually earning All-Metro and All-State honors as a senior, but also excelling on the baseball diamond, as he was drafted by the San Diego Padres in 1993. Yet Dillon was set on playing football, but for a couple reasons, D1 programs weren't exactly eager to sign him. The first and most obvious reason being that he failed to meet the minimum academic requirements to play D1 football coming out of high school. But he also had a lengthy juvenile record, which included a conviction for conspiracy to sell cocaine when he was 15. But Dillon has denied that. His first stop after high school was Edmonds Community College to play baseball, but the hour-and-a-half daily bus ride was too much, so he quit after a month and a half, and he would spend the rest of the year not doing much, until his mother forced him to get a job. But after a couple months as a night janitor, he knew he couldn't live like that. So Dillon would enroll at Garden City Community College for the '93 season, and on the field he would be great, starring at running back and free safety, as he rushed for 1,165 yards and 16 touchdowns. But off the field, he would skip class and get into fights. And then less than a month before the beginning of his sophomore year, his coach had had enough of his off-field distractions and kicked him off the team. And this is where Dillon's story could have ended. But before cutting him, his coach had called the staff at Dixie State University, which was a D2 program in Utah, and suggested they take a chance on the supremely talented back, saying he was a player that wanted to succeed, but didn't know how. As Dillon was described as an aggressive person with a short fuse, which is great on the football field, but not in the hallway or in math class. And maybe Dillon realized this too, as he reportedly had done a complete 180 once arriving at Dixie State, taking his academics seriously and giving his all on every play, even in practice. And a focused Dillon was dangerous, as he would finish the '95 season rushing for 1,899 yards and 20 touchdowns. And now he was a highly coveted JuCo prospect, so when his '96 junior season came along, he was back home, playing D1 football for the Washington Huskies. The Huskies had a good offense, with future NFL players like redshirt freshman quarterback Brock Heward, freshman receiver Jerome Pathon, and junior running back Rashawn Sheehy. And Sheehy was the starter to begin the season, but he would deal with nagging injuries. And as Dillon continued to produce with more playing time, he became the starter about a third of the way through the season, and in turn became the Huskies' workhorse. So even though Dillon started just 8 games, he would finish as a top 5 rusher in the nation, and his 22 rushing touchdowns and 23 total touchdowns would both be the highest mark in the nation, as Dillon was named a third-team All-American. And he didn't just dominate this year, he set records. In an October 19th game versus UCLA, Dillon would record 5 touchdowns in a 41-21 win, which would kick off a 6-game win streak. But it was the 5th win of that streak where Dillon played like a man possessed. Washington would host San Jose State on November 19th, and in the first quarter alone, Dillon would rush for 222 yards, as well as 2 touchdowns. And if that wasn't impressive enough, he would also add an 83-yard catch-and-run touchdown, as not only had he set the single-quarter rushing record, but he also set the record for all-purpose yards in a quarter with 305. And that's what he would finish with, because with the Huskies up 25-0 after 1, Dillon would get the rest of the game off, as Washington won 53-10. They would then beat Washington State to end their regular season at 9-2 and rank number 12 in the nation, as they would get a spot in the Holiday Bowl versus number 8 Colorado. Dillon would score 2 first-quarter touchdowns, as Washington took a 14-0 lead, but by the end of the game, they had lost 33-21, as Dillon finished with 140 rushing yards and his 2 scores. but his overall season had seen him dominate D1 with a then Huskies single-season rushing record of 1,555 yards and a still-standing Huskies record of 22 touchdowns, or 1,695 yards and 24 touchdowns if you include the bowl game, and he would add 15 catches for 273 yards and another touchdown. Even though Dillon still had a year of eligibility, he felt he had proved enough, as he would declare for the '97 NFL Draft. Dillon was a top 10 talent, but his past had followed him, and reportedly had a lot of teams hesitant to take a chance on him. But he had been trying to show that he wasn't a bad guy, as he had started a free, annual, week-long summer football camp. Yet it wasn't until the second round until his name would be called, but he didn't even hear it, as after he fell out of the top 10, he secluded to his room and cried. So even though Dillon was hurt, he was still the 43rd pick in the NFL Draft by the Cincinnati Bengals, and would promptly accept their contract offer and report to camp, as the Bengals had just gotten one of the biggest steals of the draft. Cincinnati was coming off an 8-8 season, but had made some changes, as they had a new coach in Bruce Coslet, and they had chose not to re-sign their top running back from last year in Garrison Hurst. They had a decent passing offense led by quarterback Jeff Blake, with the top receivers being Darnay Scott and Carl Pickens. And to begin the season, Dillon found himself behind second-year back Kajana Carter on the depth chart, and although he wouldn't be a backup for long, he was still a backup longer than he should have been. But an invaluable influence on a rookie Corey Dillon was longtime Bengals quarterback Boomer Esiason, who had spent a few years with New York and Arizona before returning for one last season in '97. The veteran QB would take Dillon under his wing and not only help him learn the offense, but also teach him how to navigate life as a pro athlete. After 8 weeks, the Bengals were 1-7. Dillon had started one game in that time, but had never had a game with 10 or more carries. But with Carter struggling with a shoulder injury all year, the Bengals had nothing to lose going into a Week 9 matchup with San Diego. And even though Dillon wouldn't start, he would get 19 carries and go for 123 yards and a touchdown, as the Bengals broke the losing streak. The following week, he would have 97 yards on 22 carries and another touchdown in a win over the Colts, and then would have 78 yards in a loss to Pittsburgh. But going into Week 13, the Bengals made some changes, as Esiason would start at QB the rest of the year and play very well, while Dillon was finally the lead back, and over his first 2 starts, he would rush for a combined 202 yards and a touchdown, as the Bengals went 1-1. But in a Week 15 matchup versus the Tennessee Oilers, Dillon would be breaking records again. The Bengals would win the game, as Dillon would score 4 touchdowns, with his best being a 31-yard run in the second quarter. But he didn't just have 4 touchdowns at the end of the game. He had broken Jim Brown's single-game rookie rushing record with 246 yards, which has since been broken by Adrian Peterson. But Dillon would remain the starter for the rest of the year, as the Bengals would win their final 2 games, and they had a respectable recovery from a 1-7 start, finishing at 7-9, yet still missing the playoffs. But Dillon had made his mark, as he would finish second in Offensive Rookie of the Year voting behind Warrick Dunn, and had led all rookies in rushing and rushing touchdowns, while even finishing top 10 in the league in both categories, with his rookie year seeing him rush for 1,129 yards, on a career-high 4.8 yards per carry, and 10 touchdowns, while also catching 27 balls for 259 yards. Dillon would still have his bumps on his path to redemption, as over the offseason he had been arrested for driving under the influence. But going into Dillon's second year, Esiason had retired, and the '98 season would see the Bengals roll out newly acquired Neil O'Donnell as their primary starter. And Pickens and Scott would play well, combining for over 1,800 yards through the air. But Carter would suffer a wrist injury in the first game of the year, which would end his season, leaving Dillon as their workhorse back in '98. Yet this would be the beginning of a dark period of Bengals football, as this season they featured one of the league's worst scoring offenses and its worst scoring defense. And even though there wasn't a lot to cheer about, Dillon would have another great year. He recorded 4 games with at least 100 yards on the ground, as he surpassed his rushing total from last year. But being part of a poor offense who was often playing from behind, Dillon didn't have as many scoring chances, as he would only record 4 touchdowns this year. But he would have his first career receiving touchdown in a Week 8 loss to Oakland. But the Bengals didn't do much winning, as after a 2-3 start to the year, they would go 1-10 the rest of the way, including a 9-game losing streak, as they tied for the league's worst record at 3-13, with Dillon's year seeing him go for 1,130 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground, while hauling in 28 balls for 178 yards and 1 more touchdown. And even though Dillon was already looking like a premier back, he would break through further in 1999. The Bengals had possessed the 3rd pick in the '99 draft, but would end up missing, as they selected Oregon QB Achilles Smith. Yet Jeff Blake would be their primary starter at quarterback this year. Pickens would have a solid year, but had seen a drop in his production. Yet it was made up for by Scott having the best year of his career. And with injury again limiting Carter to just 3 appearances and 6 carries this season, Dillon was once again in line for his usual workload, and his body was more prepared for this, as in April prior to this season, he had quit drinking and smoking. But even with a rejuvenated Dillon, there wouldn't be much winning in Cincy, as although their scoring offense had improved slightly, they again allowed the most points in the league. Dillon would manage 5 games with at least 100 yards rushing, but again didn't get many scoring opportunities, with just 5 rushing touchdowns. After 11 weeks, the Bengals were 1-10, but Dillon would have a good stretch from weeks 12 through 14, as he would rush for at least 120 yards in each game, including a season-high 192 yards and 3 touchdowns in a win over Cleveland, as the Bengals went 3-0 during this stretch. But they would lose the next week, and then with no chance at the playoffs, Dillon would be inactive for their final game of the year. Yet even though he played on a team who often had to abandon the run, and would sit out the final game of the year, his 1,200 rushing yards were still a top 10 mark in the league, and would get him his first Pro Bowl selection. But the Bengals had finished the year at 4-12 and missed the playoffs, as Dillon's season saw him rush for 1,200 yards and 5 touchdowns, while adding 31 catches for 290 yards and 1 more touchdown. Over the offseason, Dillon would sign a 1-year extension with the Bengals, but it seemed that he wasn't completely thrilled to still be there, as months prior to the signing, he had not only threatened to sit out the first 10 games, but also suggested that he would rather be flipping burgers over playing for the Bengals, while criticizing owner Paul Brown. And he would find himself in more trouble with the law, as he was charged with 4th-degree assault of his wife, and would later be ordered to enter a violence program and refrain from any other violations for 18 months to have the charges dropped. This time the Bengals had the 4th pick in the draft, and would select Florida State wide receiver Peter Warrick. Jeff Blake had left in free agency, meaning Smith was the team's primary starter in 2000, but he would underwhelm. Yet his weapons were depleted, as Pickens had left for Tennessee, and Scott would suffer a season-ending injury in early August, so the rookie Warrick would act as their top receiver and put up solid numbers. But once again, the offense would go as far as Dillon could take them, with his 315 rushing attempts being a top 10 mark in the league, and his career-high 1,435 rushing yards being top 5, as he would earn another Pro Bowl selection. Once again, the Bengals were struggling, as after 6 games they were 0-6, and had been shut out in 3 of those games. Up to that point, Dillon's numbers had been low, as Cincy often had to abandon the run, and he had rushed for just 323 yards and a touchdown on less than 3.5 yards per carry. But the Bengals were set to take on the Broncos in Week 8, and Dillon had another record to break. Dillon would rush for 58 yards in the first quarter, then have just 19 yards and would cough up a fumble in the second quarter. As going into halftime, the Bengals were down 4 and Dillon had 77 yards. But he would really come alive in the third, as he had 93 yards to bring his total to 170. But then in the fourth, he would record 108 yards on the ground, as he had 65 and 41-yard touchdown runs in the final 5 minutes of a 10-point loss. As overall, he would finish with 278 rushing yards, which would break Walter Payton's record of 275 yards, set nearly 23 years earlier. However, this record has since been broken multiple times. So the following week, Dillon would have 137 yards on the ground, as halfway through the season he was now sitting at 738 rushing yards. He would have more than 80 yards on the ground in just 3 more games this year, but he would have another stellar performance in a Week 14 defeat of Arizona, when he rushed for 216 yards and a touchdown. However, even though it had been a career year for Dillon, the Bengals turned in another 4-12 season and missed the playoffs, as Dillon finished the year rushing for 1,435 yards and 7 touchdowns, along with 18 catches for 158 more yards. After an 0-3 start last season, the Bengals had replaced Coslet with defensive coordinator Dick LeBeau, so the 0-1 season would have LeBeau at the helm for the entire year. The Bengals had another top 5 pick, and this time would hit, as they selected Missouri defensive end Justin Smith. And on top of that, they had selected future franchise greats in later rounds, as they picked up receivers Chad Johnson in the 2nd round, and then TJ Hujmanzada in the 7th round. And the team would make a couple signings to try to improve their offense further, as they acquired quarterback John Kitna, who would become their starter, as well as fullback Lorenzo Neal. And Scott had returned from injury to put together a solid year alongside the second-year Warrick. The Bengals were the lowest scoring team in the league, but saw a slight improvement on their win total, due to the defensive-minded LeBeau leading them to a scoring defense in the top half of the league. Dillon received a then career-high 340 carries, which would be 2nd in the league, yet would average less than 4 yards per carry, as he would finish with 1,315 yards this season, yet it would still be a top 10 mark in the league. Additionally, his 10 rushing touchdowns would be top 5, and the first time since his rookie year that he cracked double-digit touchdowns, as he was named to his 3rd straight Pro Bowl. Dillon would have 4 games with at least 100 yards, but would also have 8 games with less than 70. The Bengals would start 2-0, and by week 7 they were 4-3. And in that time, Dillon had ripped off a career-long 96-yard touchdown run in a win versus Detroit. But then they would lose 7 straight. And even though they would win their final 2 games, a 6-10 record wouldn't be enough for the playoffs, as Dillon's year saw him rush for 1,315 yards and 10 touchdowns, while hauling in 34 passes for 228 more yards. But Dillon's incredible talent was being wasted, and 2002 would be rock bottom for the Bengals during Dillon's time there. Scott had been released, but the second-year Johnson would break out as the team's leading receiver, combining with Warwick for close to 1,800 yards. Additionally, Dillon would be running behind a Pro Bowl fullback, as Neal would earn his first career Pro Bowl selection. Dillon would still be top 10 in rushing and rushing attempts this year, but his touchdown totals had dropped. The Bengals were still one of the lowest scoring teams, but after featuring a respectable defense last year, they allowed the most points in the league this year. And since they were often playing from behind, Dillon would be more involved than ever in the passing game, as his 43 receptions and 298 receiving yards were both career highs. Dillon would have 5 games with 100 yards rushing and would score in 5 games, with his best performance coming in a Week 5 loss to the Colts, when he rushed for a season-high 164 yards and 2 touchdowns. But since he would start the year 0-7, then after breaking their streak, they would immediately go on another 6-game losing streak, as they would ultimately finish the year at 2-14. So there wasn't much to cheer about in Cincinnati. But one highlight came in Week 4 versus Tampa Bay, when Dillon would pass James Brooks as the Bengals' all-time leading rusher. But a horrible team season would see Dillon finish with 1,311 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground, while adding 43 catches for 298 yards through the air. The Bengals would turn over a new leaf in 2003, but it would be a season to forget for Dillon. Marvin Lewis was now the man in charge going into 2003, and Neal had left for San Diego. The Bengals had received the 1st overall pick and selected USC quarterback Carson Palmer, but he would learn under John Kitna all year, never seeing any game action. Additionally, for the first time since he entered the NFL, Dillon had some competition in the backfield, as 3rd-year back Rudi Johnson was showing improvement and would get plenty of opportunities, as Dillon would be hampered by a groin injury this season, which limited him to just 13 games and 11 starts, putting up career lows across the board. And for the first time in his career, he wouldn't finish as the team's leading rusher. Dillon had hurt his groin in a Week 3 loss to Pittsburgh, and then would leave early in a Week 4 game against Cleveland. He would only appear in 3 of the next 6 games, amassing just 65 yards on 31 carries and a touchdown in those games. He would feel healthy in a win versus San Diego, when he recorded his only 100-yard game of the season, going for 108 yards on 18 carries. But after this, he would carry the ball just 45 times over the final 5 games of the year, even though he started each game, which led to frustration, as Dillon felt that he was underused and that the Bengals had already made up their mind of who they wanted their back to be. So it looked like Dillon was probably over his time in Cincinnati, but he made things abundantly clear after a loss to Cleveland to wrap up an 8-8 season and another year of missing the playoffs, as he would throw his uniform piece by piece into the stands. So a frustrating season for Dillon would end with him rushing for just 541 yards and 2 touchdowns, while pulling in 11 catches and 71 more yards. But just a few months after the season, the Bengals would ship away the best running back in franchise history.
Bengals all-time leading rusher, now a Patriot, Marvin Lewis, now rid of his biggest thorn with the NFL draft 5 days away.
So out of all teams the former Pro Bowl back could go to, he was sent to the defending Super Bowl champion Patriots for a 2nd-round pick. And if there was one weakness the Pats had last year, it was their rushing attack, as they ranked bottom 5 in the league, and their leading rusher from the year before in Antoine Smith was a free agent. The Pats were obviously led by Tom Brady, but now they had a soon-to-be 30-year-old Dillon in the backfield. And if there was any concern that he was on the decline, he silenced those doubts this season for a Pats rushing attack that was top 10 in the league. He would set career highs in carries, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, as he would finish top 5 in carries and rushing yards, and top 10 in rushing touchdowns, while being voted to his 4th and final Pro Bowl. He was running behind a good O-line, but it was his consistency that was perhaps most impressive, as he would appear in 15 games, starting 14 of them, but would have just 1 game below 80 yards rushing, while recording 9 games with over 100 yards, which included a 4-game stretch from weeks 6 through 10, when he had a combined 483 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. But more importantly, Dillon was finally on a winning team, as the Pats started the year 6-0, then after losing one would go on another 6-game win streak. as they ultimately finished with the second best record in the league at 14-2. And when it came time for the postseason, Dillon showed that he didn't fade away under the bright lights. In their divisional round matchup versus the Colts, Dillon rushed for 144 yards on just 23 carries, as he helped New England control the ball and extend possessions. The AFC Championship brought the Steelers, who had finished with the league's best record. And although Dillon didn't have his same success, he would still lead all rushers with 73 yards and would score a third quarter touchdown, as the Pats won and had an opportunity to repeat as champs, as they would meet the Eagles in the Super Bowl. This would be a close game, with Dillon again leading all rushers, as on top of having 75 yards on the ground, he would add 3 catches for 31 more yards, and would score an early fourth quarter touchdown to put the Eagles up 21-14 in a game they would win 24-31. As Dillon's first playoff experience ended with him as a Super Bowl champion, with his first year in New England seeing him rush for a franchise record 1,635 yards and 12 touchdowns, along with 15 catches for 103 yards and another touchdown. So the trade was already a success, but Dillon wouldn't be able to replicate his 0-4 totals in 2005. He was still a big part of the offense, but just couldn't get going due to nagging ankle and calf injuries, as he would fail to crack 1,000 yards and have just 2 games rushing for at least 100. However, he was still the Pats' leading rusher by far, and was more active in the passing game. But his scoring didn't suffer due to his bruising running, as he was a valuable short yardage and goal line back, and his 12 rushing touchdowns would be top 5 in the league. The Pats' defense had taken a hit, as they had released Ty Law, and would see linebacker Teddy Bruschi limited to 9 games, with safety Rodney Harrison having his season cut short after 3 games, due to a torn ACL. So with a banged up Dillon and a depleted defense, they would manage just a 10-6 record, which was still enough for a wildcard berth versus Jacksonville. The Pats would win easily, although Dillon would have his struggles, putting up just 40 yards on 17 carries. But they were still advancing to a divisional round matchup with Denver. Yet this is where their season would end. Dillon had a solid 13 carries for 57 yards, but Denver would end the Pats' three-peat hopes with a 27-13 victory, as Dillon's regular season ended with him rushing for 733 yards and 12 touchdowns, while adding 22 catches for 181 yards and 1 more touchdown. 06 saw the Pats' elite defense return as they were much healthier. Dillon was still the lead back and would appear in all 16 games, starting 13 of them, but they had scooped up a rookie out of Minnesota in the first round of the draft in Lawrence Maroney, as they were clearly planning for the future. But Dillon would still have a solid year, splitting carries with Maroney, as the two combined for over 1,500 yards rushing, and Dillon maintained his goal line role, as his 13 rushing touchdowns were a career high and a top 5 mark in the league. And with a top 10 scoring offense and defense, the Pats had improved on last year to finish at 12-4 and get a wildcard matchup with the Jets. Dillon would have 10 carries for 53 yards and a touchdown in a blowout win, setting up a divisional round matchup versus San Diego. But this game would see Dillon get just 8 carries for 18 yards, as the Pats pulled off a come-from-behind win to get an AFC Championship berth. This would be another Brady versus Manning matchup, and even though these had usually gone in Brady's favor, a late-game interception would seal the game for Indy, as Dillon had rushed 7 times for 48 yards and a touchdown, and his regular season ended with him rushing for 812 yards and 13 touchdowns, while adding 15 catches for 147 yards through the air. The Pats would release Dillon after the season, and he would retire in August of 2007. Corey Dillon was a rare combination of size and quickness, and although he could make you miss and had the field vision to find the open hole, he had absolutely no problem lowering his shoulder and running through you. He took an interesting route to the NFL, but it was never due to a lack of talent, as he was one of the best pure runners in NFL history. He put up incredible numbers in Cincinnati and rarely got the recognition he deserved due to playing on a bad team who was rarely on prime time. But year in and year out, he would produce at an incredible rate. And then after finally getting in a winning situation, he turned in his best career year and was the main reason for the Pats' Super Bowl repeat. He was always one of the best talents on the field, but had some bad decisions follow him off the field. Yet he would do what he could to show his maturation as his career went on. But when you had a lead that you needed to hold on to, there was no better player to have in your backfield than clock-killing Corey Dillon. But that's it for today's episode on Corey Dillon. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his AFC Central and AFC North rivals. Or this one, on an even more overlooked back of the 90s and 2000s. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.